Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Solar Embrace, Chapter 4, An Evolving Journey and Destination. Oh boy. The rolling of the waves along the gradual ocean shoreline is a comforting noise, especially when one is tired. It can extend the time one sleeps, as is not only is a comforting noise, but a slight vibrations it parts on the shores can be downright heavenly to a sore aching body. It was to the sound of these rolling waves that Celestia awoke, stretching her body as she did so. As the princess continued to become more alert to her surroundings, her mind quickly noted several things at once. 1. Spike was still fast asleep, curled up in it tightly against her body, like they had lain down. His latent heat still radiated off his body in waves, rising and falling in sync with his chest. 2. Her clothes and pelt were dry thanks to the dragon's intimate heat-exuding properties. If he hadn't been one, she might have gotten sick overnight from the chills that would probably undoubtedly overtaken her. 3. And perhaps most important, the sun had risen and was slowly making its way entirely out from behind the horizon. The spell she had placed on it to continue its path regardless of her mental state was still working, it seemed. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, as if the thunderstorm that had passed through the day before was nothing but a mere memory. Groaning softly as her body protested her movement, Celestia slowly sat up, Spike's embrace falling away as she did so. It was already becoming warm once more, but since the island was at far more northerly latitudes than the islands near the equator, it was not going to become unbearably hot. What mattered to her was not their current situation, but how long it would take for the both of them to leave the coast and journey up to the dormant volcano. She remembered there was a small lake up there, and from above, even whilst falling, she could see greenery around from it. If their luck held, there would be food up there for them, or at least for her. She knew Spike could eat pretty much anything if he had to, and on this island there wasn't much in the way of diverse foodstuffs. Grasses and kinds, maybe a few fruit trees of some kinds, and if Spike was lucky, some jewels. Celestia turned and looked down towards Spike, his expression so peaceful, for one who could have died in the day before. Any other pony wouldn't have slept in a wink that night, but then again Spike was no pony, and it showed. In many ways he was stronger than he let on. His many adventures with his friends was proof enough for that. Softly, almost in a tender way, she stroked the side of his cheek. "Spike," she whispered, leaning over slightly so her lips were closer to his ear. "Spike, it's time to wake up." Okay," the dragon whispered, rolling over but not sitting up. He reached up with his hands and rubbed his face, likely his eyes. As Celestia couldn't quite see from her angle, it was slightly reminiscent of when a foal would wake up and rub their eyes in an exaggerated manner. What happened?" "Nothing has happened, Spike," Celestia said, watching as he slowly sat up. "At least nothing that didn't already happen to us the day before. We're still stranded on an island." My head." The dragon muttered, his eyes opening as his hands went to rub his temples. "I feel like I just sat through another one of Twilight's math lectures." Celestia smiled and let loose a small laugh. Yes, I've heard from your friends on how she disagrees with many of the number pi. She, if I remember correctly, thinks pi is a repeating number, but we just haven't reached the repeating part yet, or something along those lines." "Yeah, she went through the severe pi phase a few months back," Spike said, smiling a little at a memory of himself. "They say the great forests of North were permanently altered by her demand for parchment so she could write down all of the number and look for patterns. Twilight does have an unusual devotion to her studies, though I suppose this is not necessarily a bad thing," the princess said, rising up and motioning for Spike to do the same. "Come now, Spike, we must make our way to the mountain. It will be a long way up, and I should like to have made some significant progress by nightfall. It will take us at least 2 or 3 days to reach where we need to be. But the island is so small, Spike said, confusing, filtering through his tone as he took a step in front of her. Why in the world would it take us that long to get where we need to go? Spike, you forget we have to climb that mountain, and we have no tools with which to do so, Celestia said, nodding in the mountain's direction. That, and the easiest way up the slope is a long, winding path where the last lava flow was. It'll be rather sharp, I might add, so we'll have to go very slow. But can't you fly us up there? Spike asked, arching an eyebrow in disbelief. I mean, you do have wings. Celestia's wings fluttered weakly behind her, a small flash of pain gracing her otherwise calm face. My wings are hurt, Spike, more than I can say for certain. That fall in the water must have sprained them somewhat, as it does hurt to move them too fast and too far in any direction. This was no lie. She actually couldn't fly, and if she tried to, she would only end up hurting herself even more. Plus, even if my wings were not so sprained, I would be unable to support your weight and mine. And I am not leaving you behind. Oh, well, thank you, I guess, Spike said softly. Sorry about your wings, though. I know what it's like not being able to fly. His own lack of wings made him, at times, feel rather inadequate or incomplete, like something important was missing from his life. It is all right, Spike. I understand your concern, but fret not, my strength should return in a few days, the princess said, kindly laying a hand on his shoulder and giving him a light squeeze. But until then, it seems neither of us are going to be soaring in the air. She didn't fly that often, but she did enjoy the feeling. It was liberating, to be honest. Okay, so flying is out, the dragon said, taking another step forward, as if to help jog his memory. The princess's hand falling from his shoulder. What about your magic? Couldn't you just, tell him Jim report us up there? Or maybe make us some spare clothes out of the stuff here on the coast? A few sparks shot out from Celestia's horn, but nothing happened. I don't think I can use my magic to a degree such as that, the alicorn said. I feel as if though my wells of magic have been exhausted. I already put a lot of power into the spell to keep the sun rotating as normal, and with that last bit you accidentally released while we were falling, I'm afraid I won't be able to do much magic. This island has a natural magic distortion, so it will take even longer for my magic to come back than it normally would. Wow. She went on from a goddess to a hopeless in one night. She felt so embarrassed, and just plain useless. Sorry, Spike said, coming to a rather harsh realization. Alicorns and unicorns depended on their magic for their livelihoods, and day-to-day problems as often as a Pegasus depended on their wings for, well, everything. To not be able to use a very integral part of their being must have been weighing very heavily on her conscience. He'd have to pay more attention to her should she become depressed in the meantime. It is all right, Celestia said, again her hand returning to his shoulder and giving it a gentle squeeze. I'm still completely capable of getting around without the use of magic or my wings. I would undoubtedly be easier to do so with them, but fate has dealt me a rather crippling blow for the moment. So, like any princess, I must rise up to the challenge and deal with this the best I can. Wow, she sounded so inspirational when she said that. Spike sighed. Both of those options were now officially gone. Well, if magic and flying are both not possible, then we'll just have to hoof it, he said, glancing around. The jungles that covered much of the island's lower interior seemed rather thick, and it appeared as though they gave way to large fields of grasses higher up in the numerous hills around the base. Off in the distance, along the west side, a stream of water fell from a crag in the rock, likely a tributary to the river. Had he saved the princess from yesterday? What way should we take, though? I've never been here before. If my memory serves me right, those grassy hills will give way to the old lava flow I was telling you about, Celestia said, pointing to help Spike follow what she was seeing. After that, we'll make our way up. A near top to the volcano will be several caves and small lake. I remember there being a vibrant, bountiful forest up there, and the last time I was here. It should give us many of the tools we'll need. To complete the vessel? Spike asked as the two of them stepped forward in unison. The vessel that will save the world? Somehow, he doubted wood of any kind would be able to stand up to the coronal mass ejection, but Celestia's magic, if it returned anything, was possible, right? Or maybe it was buried somewhere in the volcano and needed completely lava-proof being to retrieve it? No, not exactly, Celestia said, as the pair entered the outer limits of the jungle. Already the temperature increased by nearly a dozen degrees, and the undergrowth quickly became much denser. I meant it'll provide us with the tools to survive until the time when we can save the world. We still have a little more than 2 weeks until that day arrives, and in that time it would be a horrible thing for us to grow weak. Whether from lack of food or water, we cannot let ourselves slack off. Spike, the world is depending on us. This is a task we must complete, and so we must not let ourselves falter on the journey. Yeah, I guess that makes more sense, the dragon said, ducking under a low-lying tree branch. Should I go first, or would you like to? As you know the way. It would be better for you to go before me, Spike, the princess said, stepping gingerly over a rotting log. Your sharp claws could help clear the path, as we don't exactly have any shears or machetes. That and her own magic wasn't working well enough for her to just move everything out of the way. Well, okay, but you might want to stand back, Spike said, letting out a bit more of a draconic ancestry take over his body. I don't want a swinging branch to catch you in one of your hurt wings. In a few short seconds, his talons extended a few inches more than long enough to cut through the thick undergrowth. With a slicing motion, Spike cut through the large swath of tall ferns and greenery tumbling to the ground at his feet. Celestia stayed behind Spike as he moved forward, cutting a large path through the thick brush and tall grasses. He looked, from behind at least, like a gentle colt explorer, similar to the ones from the exploratory days of old when ponies were spreading to the other continents. After he was about 10 or so feet ahead, Celestia began slowly walk behind him, making sure to stay the same approximate distance away. She didn't want to be caught by a swinging branch or one of his swipes, after all. As Spike slashed through the undergrowth, his mind drifted away from the task at hand and roamed back to what had happened the day before. More specifically, what had happened before, during, and after that thunderstorm. It was rather strange that Celestia had chosen to just let the carriage fly through that large gathering of unfriendly clouds. Perhaps she had simply thought they would be perfectly safe. Well, now we know just how safe we really are, Spike thought to himself, slicing through a cluster of vines that hung down from the uppermost branches of a few trees. I think that's the first time I've seen Celestia be wrong in a dangerous situation. I mean, she was defended by Chrysalis, since that changeling was so hopped up on Shining Armor's love, but why did she say we'd be safe? Was she not concerned at all for us? Or was she simply thinking that if she was there, then both of us would be fine? It was not like him to doubt the princess, and as much as he didn't want to, he had a small well of doubt build up in the pit of his stomach. He sighed as he ducked under a branch that was far too thick for him to slice through. Speaking of being up there, he felt terrible for what he had done when he had gotten stuck in her. Wow, he couldn't even think of it to himself in the correct terms. Okay, when he was stuck, he had tried almost everything to pry himself out of her, and yet she had apparently freed him without much difficulty. She had told him it was okay when he tried to apologize, but Spike was not so sure that it was the case. Seriously, how many beings ever got to feel Celestia in the way he had done? Head stuck between her soft, cushiony breasts, his hands fondling those orbs as her nipples poked into the palms through the fabric. Damn it, Spike, you can't think like that, the dragon whispered to himself, mentally trying to shut down the train of thought. It would do him no good out here to be thinking of the princess like that, and yet His brain rebelled against his control. He could still feel her body shudder around him when his hot breath traveled down her dress. He could still hear her stifled moans when his tail slapped against her posterior. And oh, what a glorious posterior it had been, even though he had never truly fondled or slapped one before in his entire life. Spike could tell that Celestia had an ass that put many others to shame. It was round yet firm. It neither sagged nor bounced without a strong input of force, and even under that dress his sensitive tail could tell it was soft. Soft like the finest silks and smoother than the velvet dress shirt Twilight had made him wear to a fancy ball the year before. It was an amazing ass, an ass worthy of a song. It was glory ass. But the more he tried to tell his brain to shut the Tartarus up and think of something else, the more he thought back to the princess and the way she had lain with him, her body cold from the watery grave she had so narrowly escaped, with help from him, he reminded himself, had curled into his without effort or difficulty. They fit perfectly together when entangled in the manner they had been the night before, and Spike had felt the beating of her heart, even in sleep, in tune with his own. He had never imagined the sound an Alicorn's heart would make, and Celestia's was nothing like a frantic pounding of a scared pony. No, it was more like a steady beating of a drum, slow, measured, filled with potential power and purpose that few others could hope to understand, if not explain. It was the heartbeat of one who had seen much in her life, and would likely see much more. Spike had no idea why it was so alluring to him. Perhaps a long-lived species such as him found comfort in the arms of one who could match or surpass his longevity. Then he remembered against his will the feeling of her body against his own, the softness of her pelt, the delicate arms that intertwined with his own. Sometime during the last night, he supplely powerful legs, protected by the weight of his tail. It was maddening. He had always thought her attractive, as one would a relative or even a friend, but now he wasn't so sure. One of her hands had interlaced with his, and although he had only awoken for a few minutes during that night, it had been enough to startle him. He had never known any pony like a princess, especially Celestia, to be so intimate. He hated using that word, and what it implied made him want to hide from her, but it was nonetheless a true statement. Celestia always slept alone in her quarters, as all of Equestria knew, but Spike had never expected her to be a cuddler. The more he tried to think of it, non-Celestia things, the more he noticed just how beautiful she was. She was skinny, but not in a starved sense, enough to be slim, but was still enough meat on her bones to have an actual figure. Spike had seen the models in Rarities fashion magazines, thin stick figures without a single redeeming feature. The princess did have a velvet waistline, but unlike those models, it was not that way from starvation or negative calorie consumption. It was defined, toned to the highest degree by a combination of what must have been working out and disposition for a higher metabolism. She did have a large amount of cakes and other sweets in her diet, and yet none of it showed on her body. Her hips came down from her glorious behind, and were from the kind that made her knees go ever so slightly weak, that combined with her lithe legs made his mouth involuntary water slightly, an action that both disgusted and slightly intrigued him. Celestia was a package deal, a knockout body, a gorgeous face, a pelt tail, and mane that would make any red-blooded stallion cry, and a kind disposition that would leave any other stallion crying. "I'm not worthy to be near you," or something. Spike felt horrible thinking about her like this. If he hadn't been looking away from her, he would have felt like he was undressing her with his eyes, like some lecherous lowlife, wrestling away how he thought of her soft, beautiful wings. He concentrated on cutting through the foliage, doubling his efforts to hold back his imagination. However, the dragon was not having the only thoughts like these. Celestia herself, though used to being in front of many a group, couldn't help but look over Spike as he cut through the undergrowth in front of her. The way his tail swayed from side to side behind like a snake preparing to strike the way his shirt bounced around his shoulders and swung his arms left and right to clear a path. The princess couldn't have been more thankful that the dragon saving her life the night before, but there was something she found herself even more grateful for. She had been alone much of her life, in an intimate way, anyway. She had never known a lover's caress, a warm body sleeping next to her own, and yet last night Spike had showed her the latter without a single word of protest. He had never left her side that night, his body entangled in hers in ways that still brought a pleasurable chill to her body. Celestia was not one for wasted emotions, and everything she did out of the goodness of her heart and for others. But right now she wanted nothing more than to lay next to him again, if only to recapture that feeling she had night before. This dragon had been destined from his assignments as no other being so perfectly suited her needs. He was more than just brave, having volunteered for his without much protest or indignation. He was kind, he was funny, he was brave when he needed to be, and gentle all of the time. He would be able to take in stride what she would eventually dish out, and if properly nudged, would respond in kind to her advances. He had given her his complete trust, something she knew she was going to break in less than 3 weeks. But right now, she wasn't thinking of his trust, nor his cute behind, nor his oddly arousing and intoxicating smell that came off of him in waves. No, she was thinking about him, or how he was going to make her into a proper mare. Surely that rarity friend of his had given him some friendly affection, right? He was a very fine specimen of the dragon race, and his looks had only skyrocketed from when he was a cute youngster. That strong chin, that firm yet strong body, those hands that had no delicately and yet roughly, accidentally as well, fondled her in the carriage as they went through the storm. His height was attractive in Celestia anyways, and his spines were somehow intriguing as well. It was during this train of thought that the princess forgot to look where she was going, and as such part of her dress caught on a large thorn bush and almost fell when her momentum was halted by the garnered thorny branches, and she was stopped and tried to tug her dress out of the plant. It remained stuck fast, and she turned to Spike. "Spike!" she called. He didn't respond. He must have been off on his own little world. "Spike!" she called again, with more urgent tone in her voice. Again, no response. The dragon was obviously either focusing on the task at hand or deep in thought. Seeing as how calling to Spike wasn't producing any results, Celestia turned back and tried to maneuver the dress out with her hands. That failed at a rather spectacular way as she continuously poked her fingers and palms into the sharp thorns. Accepting she couldn't maneuver out, she resorted to pulling at it again. The more she pulled gently, the more it seemed to entangle herself in the woody plant. Sighing in defeat, she just pulled as hard as she could, and suddenly she was free. Of course, that freedom had come at a price, judging from the great tearing sound that accompanied it. Looking down, Celestia saw the bottom portion of her dress had torn away, the rest now only extending down an inch past her knees. Her legs were open in the warm, moist air, and she felt a sudden small breeze filter under her, gracing the previously hidden pelt of her like a soft caress. This made her at least a little angry, as many of the finest designers in Equestria had fretted over a hand-stitched this dress to fit her form perfectly. A brave and lucky few, both stallion and mare, had gotten to see her put it on, and they had all been sworn to secrecy. It had been made of some of the finest materials and could buy with her own rather expensive fortune, and so it was rather understandable that she was at least a little peeved it ripped. Shuddering slightly from the amount of anger and the breeze filtering across her lower legs, Celestia reached to catch up with Spike, who had stopped for some reason on his own. When she drew nearer, she saw that he had somehow gotten both arms stuck in the same kind of thorn bush as she had, though these were much taller. With two equally ferocious-sounding tearing noises, Spike tore his sleeves off his shirt, exposing his scaly biceps from the princess to see. Since when did Spike work out? At least That was Celestia's first thought when she saw his bulging muscle. It was not massive, like those she had seen on Applejack's brother when she had visited the family farm during the Sisterhood's social 2 years previously, yet they were nothing to scoff at. Perhaps all the time helping Applejack on the farm during Big Mac's sickness last year had really paid off. Or maybe it was hauling around all those bird seed for Fluttershy's menagerie for birds, or helping Pinkie Pie haul cooking ingredients into the sugar cube corner. Whatever the case, they looked very firm, like there were solid bricks sewn beneath his scales. She trailed down his back and pushed through the undergrowth, wondering just what else he could be hiding under all his clothes. Once again, her inattentiveness gave way to the slightest disaster, and after another fierce toggle with some thorn bush, she caught up with Spike, minus the sleeves of her dress she had previously had. However, unlike her groan, she had managed to save the fabric it had ripped off. She prepared she could use it for something later. "Spike, why did you stop?" she asked, almost bumping into him, after she went around the corner and cleared path. "You might want to see this for yourself," the dragon said, pointing in front of him. Celestia walked up beside him, peered through the underbrush, and gasped. The thorn bushes they had been dealing with were nothing compared to what lay before them. A wall of thorns at least 20 feet high lay before them, and no matter which way he looked, it seemed to stretch on forever and ever. They grew thick and matted series of knots that looked more like some defensive barricade than living group of plants. It was an obstacle neither of them had expected. "So, what do we do about this?" Spike asked, glancing at the princess as he folded his arms across his chest. I don't know. I'll need to think for a bit," Celestia said softly, looking around, spotting an old stump. She gently walked over and sat down, putting her head in her hands. She needed to think of something, anything, to get them over these thorns. Having Spike set them on fire was far too risky. What if the entire island burst into flame? Plus, he may have been fireproof, but she surely was not. And the only place she would be safe from the fire in their current location was the river. That, in of itself, pretended a health risk. She could get hypothermia, and of her clothes could shrink, and she'd get a horrible rash. Or perhaps there were a few sharks that swam up the river. The outermost part did flow out into what looked like a marsh-like mangrove swamp, and Celestia knew from her biology books that quite a few shark species had their babies there. No, they could not burn the wall. Celestia would be put into terrible danger, and Spike would have much more trouble trying to get through it. Plus, he'd have to clear a path wide enough for her to not be skewered, and if he did that, he'd be dead, tired by the time he reached the other side. Even worse, they didn't know just how thick the wall of thorns was. It was 100 feet thick or only 15. Oh, it was so hard to think clearly. When she was like this, her body was not up to its usual standards for sure. Her magic was fluctuating with the islands. Her mind was still frazzled from a brush with death, and perhaps least helpful was the fact she could feel her heart beginning. It started off as subtle at the very beginning of it all, and every day it would build slowly until it reached its peak. The first thing to go would be rational sense of thought and apparent intelligence to aid in the acquiring of a mate. Intelligence more often intimidated the opposite sex when was a female, which was a possible reason why Twilight rarely, if ever, went on dates. While Celestia was thinking to herself, Spike leaned against the wall of a giant thorn, not caring if they poked through or tore into his shirt. It was just a shirt, not something valuable after all. As an afterthought, he retracted his talons a bit, so they were no longer than when he had woken up. Looking back to remembering the path they had constructed, he tried to calculate just how far they had gone. A half mile, 2/3 of a mile, maybe? The island itself had been several miles across, and he knew they were not far from the coast, as all of it was the case. It was just so hard to tell how far he had gone. His path, while never very twisting in nature, was likely quite a bit longer than if they had somehow managed to make a completely straight one, adding to the fact that the path wound up at the bottom, down a few large hills, and for all they knew they were only a third a mile from where they had started. Maybe getting on top of the thorn wall, which seemed to break above the sky-swallowing treetops, could give a better judgment of distance. He thought of these things for a very simple reason. So he wouldn't think about Celestia anymore. He had finally managed to cut off his train of thought about how the Alicorn mare when he had stopped at the wall of thorns. Only in his eyes, they weren't thorns. Some of the larger ones looked more like shaped railroad spikes, and some of the smaller ones grew in bunches that looked like they could hold a rampaging minotaur in place. But even as he tried to keep his mind off the princess, Spike's eyes turned towards her, looking directly at her face. He was not trying to keep his eyes off her body, nor was he trying to memorize her facial features. Instead, he was watching her think. The way she furrowed her brow, how her tongue would occasionally flit out of her mouth and brush over the bottom lip, way she'd occasionally bite that same lower lip. To put it in simply, he found her actions downright adorable, which some might think is weird. He didn't. She'd even scrunch her nose up in a cute way that made her look like she'd smelled something questionable. Celestia turned to Spike, who, upon seeing she was staring back at him, quickly averted his eyes. "Spike, is something the matter?" the princess asked, having just ruled out a bridge over the thorns. It'd take way too damn long, and they'd likely deforest a huge area to get the supplies. It's nothing, Celestia, the dragon said, hurriedly, thankfully remembering their deal and using her name instead of her title. It's just I was thinking. Yeah, I was thinking was all. About what? The princess asked, rising from the stump and walking up to him. Damn, she wasn't making this easy for him. She'd caught him looking at her, and now he had to think of something plausible, or her questioning would make him confess. About the thorns, he said slowly, his brain working furiously to try and get everything he was thinking of to fit together. Could I climb over them? And they can't hurt me after all, and they are pretty thick. The princess muttered, stroking her chin softly as she looked up the thorn wall. You know, that's not a bad idea, Spike. Only, where will I climb? I'm no dragon, just a soft, easily damaged alicorn with no impenetrable scales. Oh yeah, forgot about that, Spike said, rubbing the back of his neck in an embarrassed manner. How would she get over if he climbed? She couldn't fly, teleport, or even float herself over with a bit of magic. And she sure as Tartarus couldn't dig under the damn thing. He had a feeling the root system would be too thick for even him to dig under, and there was no telling if the tunnel could collapse under the weight above it. Wait a minute, if he climbed, she could get over the thorns. I think I know of a way, but I want your opinion on this, Spike said, stepping away from the thorn wall. A few small holes were left in the back of his shirt, and there was a slight gash down his lower part. Go ahead, Spike, Celestia said, curious as to what he could have thought of. He hadn't been silent for very long, so maybe his mind was a bit sharper than she thought. Well, if you climbed on my back and held on tight, I'm sure I could climb up across those thorns, Spike said. Of course, to help support you better and move around safer, I'd have to walk on all fours. It'd be a slower way than if I walked upright, for sure, but I wouldn't be able to securely hold onto those thicker ones with my feet. So what do you say? Celestia was silent for a few moments, the gears in her head churning as she judged Spike's plan and weighed her other options, except there weren't really any other options. I would say your plan is rather creative, even if a bit unorthodox, the princess said, a small smile gracing her full lips. But how am I going to hang on for longer than an amount of time? We don't have a rope, and even though my physical strength has returned, I don't think I could hold on for too long. Should this wall be thicker than anticipate? You'll sling your arms around my neck and hold on, Spike simply said. Once I'm on top, you'll be laying down against instead of hanging off of me. So it shouldn't be much of a problem. He knew he was right, but Spike was not sure just how far he would have to go. Those thorns would no doubt hold his weight, but would they hold the combined weight of him and Celestia? Then let us begin, Celestia said, taking a step back. Spike turned around and grabbed onto a few good handholds, his scales providing small latches on which the thorn tips could catch, but not puncture. He looked back at the princess, a sudden look of apprehension flickering across her features. "Well, come on then," the dragon said, simply jerking his head in a come-here motion. "It's almost midday, and I'm sure you'd like to be far from these thorns by nightfall." He did. Something about them seemed rather odd, not sinister, but then again, the thorns grow in such a configuration as this. Celestia gulped as the dragon looked away, taking a few steps closer to him. Of course she could do this. She was Princess Celestia, co-ruler of Equestria, adorned by countless ponies, loved by just as many and respected by countless beings across the planet and onwards. It wasn't like she had never been carried by another in her adult life, and she wasn't afraid of anything, except she never had been carried. She was an alicorn, and in Canterlot she had never needed a reason to be carried. Even if she had, it would have been in a royal hamper, complete with guards carrying her aloft as she weighed nothing at all. But out here, there were no Canterlot, no guards, no hampers, no plushy cushions to rest on. No, instead there was a young, deceivingly strong male dragon, shirts encompassed back, and was not sure she would be able to stay on if he were to slip slightly, though in the uppermost holes in said shirt she could see a bit of his shoulder blades bulging outwards, likely caused by the current position he was holding his arms in. Slipping her arms around his neck, she clenched her hands tightly together and pressed her body against his back, offset slightly to avoid his dorsal spine. Her legs also curled around his waist, her full weight falling on him, and she hooked her hooves together around his abdominal pelvic area. She shuddered slightly as she pressed against his lower abdomen. She was hanging onto the dragon, or a chiseled marble statue. Spike grunted slightly at the extra weight, but compared to the other things he'd had to carry in the past, Celestia weighed practically nothing. The feeling of her dress-bound breasts pressed tightly against his back did little assuage his earlier mental conflict. But Spike held on to his mind and managed to push that feeling out of his focus, pulling up and grasping another large thorn with his hand. He glanced down. Behind him, Celestia's head had been buried between his shoulder blades, and he could feel her eyes were clenched shut. She was expecting to fall at any moment. Better not let her down, then, he thought to himself, continuing to climb. Luckily, there were a lot bigger thorns close together for him to easily grab. But he had to keep his body away from the wall itself. Celestia's arms and legs would be horribly scratched if he hugged the wall. So, to help him balance a bit, he held his tail out straight behind him. The largest of his spines provided the princess something akin for a seat, so her full weight wouldn't be on his arms and legs. Celestia shivered slightly from the feeling of the posterior resting upon the spine, her body straddling the dragon's back as she held on. Thankfully, her dress was still tight enough across her bum to form a sort of seat, so the spine wouldn't wedge itself between her butt cheeks. But it was an odd experience, to say the least. It was a good thing Spike's spines were rather dull, for if they had been sharp, she might have cut right through the fabric and possibly into her. As an added bonus, every time Spike moved, her breasts involuntarily slid back and forth slightly against his back, sending a very subtle shudder up her spine. Slowly but surely, Spike climbed up the thorn wall, to the tops of the trees, getting closer and closer with each passing motion. He almost slipped once, but with one thorn crumbling under his foot, but luckily he had a better foothold on another one, and with his handholds were secure enough to handle the sudden extra weight. After that incident he had no more problems, and soon enough he passed the uppermost branches of the jungle canopy. Like the might orca bursting through the salty water off the northern coast of Equestria, he climbed up and out of the canopy, just as his hand met the ledge on a wall. Climbing up and over it, Spike sprawled himself across on all fours, his body naturally adjusting to the position due to his dragon heritage. He could feel Celestia's tremble slightly in the sudden sunlight, her shivers sending a chill through her own body. "Celestia," he said in response. "Celestia, you can open your eyes now. We're at the top of the thorns." We are?" the princess said in squeak. Wow, she must have been really frightened at the prospect of falling off of Spike, judging from her death grip. "Yes, we are," the dragon said simply, taking a few tentative steps forward. "You might want to take a look at this," his voice said soft, as if he were filled with awe. Now, what could he be seeing that would bring about such a recreation of the midst of her current attempt to cross the obstacle? Slowly, ever so slowly, Celestia opened her eyes and tilted her head up from Spike's back. What greeted her sent a bolt of astonishment directly into her brain. The thorns were like a mudslide that was swelled up into the sky like small hills and dripped down here and there. All over the place, small birds fluttered about, feasting and reddishing berries that grew off the greenery that the thorns wall top. Butterflies flittered about in the greenery, and the pink and yellow flowers were not yet tarnished into berries, attracting them with a vengeance. Off in the distance, a veritable garden on top of the hellish wall disappeared. It was another side. All around them, the jungle seemed to stretch on forever, stopping only when the few reached a river. In fact, it was likely the very same river Celestia had almost drowned in, but this was a much less mature stretch of water. Even from this distance, it looked turbulent, fast-flowing, and dangerous. After that river, the trees thinned out until only scattering shrubs and large fields of grasses and wildflowers remained. Colors of all sorts blossomed out in the terrain, and colors mixing together on one's eye if they stared too long. After that, the shrubs disappeared, and the grasses became sparse under the shadow of the mountain, looking up high until still the grasses gave way to large boulders in what would like the old lava flows, as the bare rocks looked like a muddy river frozen in place. After that, sheer rock face and thin winding ledge wound itself up and around the mountain, the natural path eventually disappearing from sight entirely. As Spike moved, Celestia continued to look around them, taking in the sight, the smell, and the suddenly transformed thorn garden. The flowers had a fragrance to them that reminded her of a cross between cinnamon and honey, with the subtle fragrance of mint coming off the green leaves. As a test, she quickly unhooked one hand and pulled off a leaf, and held it to her nose. It did indeed smell of wintergreen, and Celestia knew no poisonous plants grew on the island. She had cast a spell on the island while ago to prohibit such plants from germinating. So, as an experiment, she placed the leaf in her mouth, wound her arm back around Spike's neck, and chewed gently. Refreshing. With a slightly sour aftertaste, she said, swallowing the chewed-up leaf with a small smile of pleasure. It was good. Perhaps she would pick some more. As Spike walked, he couldn't help but feel how Celestia kept shifting her weight on his back. Glancing back, he saw her eating a few leaves, and strangely pleased look gracing her features. Feeling a bit hungry himself, he let out a long slurp out and snarl a bundle of leaves. Some ripe berries caught Imp in the mix. Retracting his wriggling tongue into his mouth, he chewed softly. The leaves are good, but the berries are strangely both sweet and sour, he thought, swallowing the mixture, snacking his tongue out again. He stopped and plucked a few berries with a mix, making sure they weren't coated in his saliva. "Here," said the alicorn. He said to the alicorn, "Try these, they're pretty good." Celestia, slightly startled by Spike's offering, gingerly accepted his small gift and propped the berries into her mouth. As the unexpected taste filled her mouth, she smiled and hummed slightly in pleasure. Who knew eating a strange food could be so good? In fact, she had had to have more. And with the tiniest burst of magic, she could afford the torn sleeves of the carried reform into a makeshift bag. Reaching out as far as she could, she began to grab leaves and berries and toss them into the bag. They need food. After all, they hadn't eaten since early yesterday. and by now they were both rather famished. A new wrinkle had been added in her cloth on that journey. They had need more food than they had anticipated, and that meant they'd eventually have to forage. Spike, after swallowing another bundle of berries and leaves, suddenly found himself at the end of the wall for the thorns. Sadly, he found this out too late and tumbled over the edge, Celestia tumbling with him. Amidst their shouts of surprise, Spike luckily managed to wedge his spade-like end of his tail into a cluster of large thorns, stopping his fall. Almost on instinct, Spike reached up and grabbed Celestia by both hands as she fell, grabbing them as her legs caught under her arms. With some great effort, he pushed back into his back, and with one hand holding in her place, he used the other to get a good grip on the wall. "Celestia, please don't freak out, but I'm going to let go of the wall with my tail," the dragon said, an idea forming in his mind a few short seconds. "What?" Celestia was only able to say before Spike's tail came free of the thorns. With another shout of surprise, Celestia felt them swing down and then around and up again until they stopped. Looking round in bewilderment, she saw that Spike had done. He had let them fall, and using the thorn as a pivot point, he had spun them and managed to end right side up. His other hand had grabbed on quickly, and now that he had control and began to slowly climb down. "Spike, you should have given me a bit more warning before you did that," the princess said, a slight tone of admonishment filtering through her voice. "I know, but it was easier that way," the dragon said as he reached the bottom of the thorn wall. Stepping off and backwards, he kneeled down slowly to the ground. Celestia hopped off his back, glad to be back on good solid ground once more. "How much did you get in your harvest period up there?" Celestia had almost forgotten about the makeshift bag she was carrying. Looking down into it, she grimaced slightly. It was some, but not near enough. "I'd say we got enough food here for another day or two, depending on how much we can conserve," she said. "Well, this is an island. I'm sure there's a lot more food for us to find out here," Spike said. As if to emphasize this point, he swept his arm out before them in a mock grandiose pose. Despite herself, Celestia let forth a little giggle. He really did act silly sometimes. "Oh, Spike, you mustn't worry about food. You were right when saying this island has much in the way of foodstuffs," the princess said with a smile. She should know a good half of the plants on this island were from her personal botanical gardens back in Canterlot, transplanted as saplings many decades ago to help the island develop an ecosystem. "Then shall we go, my lady?" Spike asked, bowing and sweeping his arms to the side to let Celestia pass him. Like a true gentle dragon, however, he had apparently forgotten the fact that the undergrowth of the jungle was still rather thick. And Celestia let loose another giggle. "Spike," she said, pointing in front of him. The dragon looked up and groaned. It was indeed going to be another long trek through the jungle interior. And so he began to tear at the foliage once more, his claws flashing in subdued light. The going was not nearly as rough as it had been before, but every now and then their clothes would catch slightly on a few errant thorn bushes. Walking behind the dragon once more, Celestia looked back at the thorn wall one last time before it was swallowed up by the jungle. So the pair of them continued their journey, the princess stopping every now and then to collect more small fruits and edible leaves, making sure to never tarry for too long. It was only a few hours after noon, and it would do them plenty good to make good progress before sundown. They both knew progress would be the key to their success. Author's note: much less pandering and much more detail, plus character interaction that promotes development. Yay! I think a lot of people will like the next chapter. I know my proofreaders and I like this one. Also, longest chapter yet. Yay! Hope you guys have enjoyed. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Peace off.